coming. Gregory Burks, who is here as a history major from UNH, but also is here to kind of talk about what it was like growing up in the South, because I believe you grew up in Alabama. And you might have some things to share with us. And this is Dr. John Kabibi, who is a psychologist here in town, and is going to kind of give us some insight into why things happen, why mobs gather, why mobs react. So I will put it all in your good hands and see that, Mark, do you want to kind of start with a little bit of introduction about yourself, and we'll go down, and then you folks can just take off.
Sure.
We welcome you to join and jump in with questions at any moment.
As Jane said, I'm the priest at Trinity Episcopal Church in Tilton, New Hampshire, but I've also been, since the late 1980s, very involved in anti-racism and diversity awareness programs in 3 states. And so when I was contacted and asked to be a part of the panel, I thought, well, you know, what is this Episcopal priest going to bring to it? But when I heard what the topic was, and I had not heard of Daisy Bates, and that kind of took me aback because of all the work that I've done in this field. And so I don't know what I'm going to bring to this discussion, but I'm glad to be here.
My name is Greg Burks. I've been living in New Hampshire now for the last 27 years. I was born in 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama, so I've left Alabama in 1981. So I watched the slow progress from the time where I could actually comprehend what was going on until I recently went back in November, and the comparison between then and now is something that's somewhat fascinating.
As I was introduced, I am a psychologist and I am in Concord. I also have a history and I think a few more years on our panelist. Jane didn't mention that I'm also originally from the South and was in high school the same years they were in high school. And I remember the tension every day on the television, identifying with this and having discussions with my father.
Where were you?
I was in New Orleans. Any first impressions from the audience about what they just saw?
Well, I never heard Daisy Bates either. It kind of pisses me off, doesn't it? Kind of, because it's, you know, she's a big deal. And I studied American history, and I studied Afro-American history, and somehow she didn't get mentioned. And all those 63 March on Washington, I don't remember seeing that clip before. So I'm quite surprised. You guys have any insight on that?
Well, you have to understand that our historians are primarily male. And with all respect to our history major, schools do not teach history, they teach propaganda, which is a sad commentary, but I believe to be true.
That's why it's called his story.
And there is a project called Her Story, the Her Story project.
No, I don't mean, when I say his story, my examination of the word would be, and I hope no one gets offended here, but this is how, his story is basically how white America made the world, made the United States. That's why it's called his story. We forged forward. We conquered the West. We came here from overseas. His story, not our story, his story.
I challenged that a little bit on 2 grounds. First, the movie itself shows that Daisy Bates was well recognized over a very long period of time after her accomplishment. Second is, I would ask this group, Randolph is mentioned very early on in the film. I'd be curious to know how many people here knew him, who he was.
Was that Randolph Johnson?
A. Philip.
A. Philip. So we have 2. A monumental figure in
Yeah.
the civil rights movement, and there's two people.
But he was also chased out of the South because of some of the things that he was accused of doing. He was the one who actually went to Martin Luther King and said, Martin Luther King, if you are going to be nonviolent, you cannot have these people guarding your house with guns. So I do know who he is. So
I know you know who he is,
it's-
but in relative knowledge of who they are, the knowledge of who he was has faded as well.
And,
But
and
that's-
with so many though, because I was listening to an NPR program yesterday about the last year of Dr. King's life, and one of the comments that was made in this program was that Dr. King was this huge tree in this forest of people, but we don't know who these people are anymore. You know, I saw the brief clip of Byron Rustin, and most people don't know who he was. And most people don't know that he took a back seat or a behind the scenes thing because he was gay. Same thing with James Baldwin. And so there were all these mixtures of people, but instead we like to sterilize our icons. And so we have Dr. King, who was wonderful. I'm not trying to say he wasn't, but that's where we put all of our stuff on this idealized picture.
yeah, but
Because that's the way we tell history.
but if you've ever noticed, every minority in the United States has to have a spokesperson. Hugo Chavez, Martin Luther King, every minority group. They're not a group, they need a spokesman. They need someone who can be either demonized, you know, it's his fault. He's stirring up our good black people. It's his fault because he won't let them go in the field and pick the fruit. You know, that's where I think that's the biggest problem, where you pick our leaders. Like you said, there are other people who were more defined, who did a lot more work, but these people were singled out as leaders because they were someone who you could say it's his fault. It's his fault for stirring this up. It's not the country as a whole who's looking at this and going, there's something wrong here. It's his fault. So, you know, it's easy to do it when you make that single person the leader.
Much like they did to Daisy Bates.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I
She
think
was a troublemaker.
any of our reformers, including Christ, is a martyr, but the spokesman to break new ground. And whenever you're breaking new ground, you start to, let's say, frighten people. If you remember Finding Nemo, the movie, we have that belief
Got a reaction.
of what's out there is dangerous. And we dare not venture, but you need somebody. And if you remember, even in Finding Nemo, there was a woman who led him, encouraged him to break through the barrier to discover the new world. And you see that throughout history, there's always someone to break that barrier. She happened to be the one, and I think we always have to look at the power of one that should give us courage to say what we have to say, to take that risk. And I think this film has a lot of sub-stories in it that go beyond just her biography, and that too has been cleaned up. I happen to have the preview version that I looked at this week, and between that and this, it's been cleaned up. And as you said, we do like to, you know, put on the pedestal our saints, our heroes, but they are human, and the audacity to speak out and say, I have something that people should hear, takes a great deal of courage. And you may indeed have some primary narcissism that says, I can do this, I'm entitled. And the preview version chastises her for that. But the thing is, without that, would she have had the courage to say what she had to say? You might say, to quote, I think it was Mark Twain, you know, we're all entitled to the faults of our virtues. And some of us happen to be more virtuous than others.
Other reactions?
I'm impressed by the courage of those 9 young students. I wish they'd been given more credit. That must have been a horrible and brave experience for them. I just can't even imagine being in that situation.
Well, you have to remember one principle, being brought up in the South and being black. You are born with the knowledge of knowing you're 3 steps behind. Okay, so you have to work twice as hard. I didn't see a new, crisp school book until I was a 6th grader. That's when I saw my first new school book. Just like in the movies, our books were handed down from the suburban schools. After they were done with them, they were old and outdated, then we got them. So actually, we were 3 steps behind. But you have to persevere. You have to keep going. You have to find a way. If you want it bad enough, and that's something that was instilled in you from things like this, education was the key. Coming up in the 60s, the 70s, I don't know what happened, but somewhere down the line we lost that. But education was the key because we were taught very young. They can do everything to you, but they can't stop you from thinking. They can't stop your mind. And once you got that, you become a threat.
Why do you think that is, that thrust has been diminished, if that is true?
Well, I don't think it's just a ethnic thing. I just think that we've gotten to the point now where we're moving in a different direction. Where I don't think that we're putting it on kids to work.
It's about jobs. It's not about learning.
Yeah.
It's not about the whole liberal arts program of becoming a better human being and a better citizen and so forth anymore. It's not about that kind of education. It's so you can get a job and make, this salary. And that seems to be our focus for the last, 15, 20 years.
But I think that everybody is coming to a point where it's all lackadaisical. It doesn't really matter anymore. Because the idea was you could always grow. But I think people are starting to realize now, or it seems to me that the kids are starting to realize now, there really is a ceiling there, and why should I care? When I get out of high school, I might find a job, I might not. I mean, there's no incentive. And that goes across all racial lines. That goes across all racial lines.
And I think what Greg is saying in terms of education was the key. Again, the secondary message, or one of the secondary messages in this film, is I think when Daisy Bates, there was a lot of ground she could have broken, but she broke the educational barrier. And while the kids maybe opened up the access to get better educated themselves, the impact of them educating the people around them. I say if you really want relationships to develop, put people in the kitchen. Because you have to work together, do things together, get dirty together, eat together, break bread together. And I think the education of these 9 students to the multitude of white people to learn that black people were not that different. They laughed, they joked, they got sad, they cried, they were just like us. And I see in the history of the world, in fact, I'm reading a very interesting book right now. It's called An Edible History of Humanity. And Daisy Bates, even in this movie, talked about food. And if we look at how colonization took place around the world, when we, the Anglo-Saxons, came to colonize America, which was populated by Native American Indians, one of the first things we did before we killed 30 million Native Americans, we enslaved them to work the sugar cane in the South.
I always thought that was so funny. I found that so amusing. The fact that they would try to enslave the Native Americans on their homeland.
But
that made no sense to me, because the only thing they do is leave.
But that's because we see different people as not human, and we do that in war. We don't kill people in war. We kill geeks, towel heads, Japs, but we don't kill people. But after killing the American Indian, and New England was producing the rum from the sugar cane from the South, we needed more slaves. So where did we go? We started stealing people from Africa. And that's why the South's population of blacks became much greater than the rest of the nation. They mentioned racism in the South, and it existed. And I can give you some personal examples of when I experienced racism. But there was racism in other parts of the United States, and still is, only because of the population density. There were black schools down in the South. There was only a few blacks in the North. So they got integrated into the schools, but the segregation took place in the housing. It was still segregation, but rather than in the schools, it was the housing. So, in a way, the South gets a bad rap for being prejudiced. It was just more blatant.
Extrovert, introvert. That's the way I look at it. Seriously, extrovert, introvert. In the South, I do not like you because of the color of your skin. In the North, wouldn't be good for you to live in this neighborhood.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? It's the same message, it's just how it's phrased. One is being blunt. The other one is, you might not like this restaurant. It's,
It's an honest racism. And we now have that with the Mexicans. And so we keep picking up any group, and this is what brings about fear, riots, and since we're in a movie theater, I'll give you another film that really is important about bigotry and racism. The movie E.T. How many of you remember that one? The whole movie is about how our xenophobia, our fear of the foreigner, the stranger, creates this riotous rejection, the contempt, because they're different. And I think when the 9 Little Rock students go in, they show the white man and woman that they're not non-human. They really are people. And that's how we ought to keep doing it, keep introducing people of different ethnicities to educate the people. And I'm not talking about academic education. I'm talking about the education of living with variety and diversity. We are not as diverse as we pretend to be.
I think it's really interesting that these 9 students, and they refer to it quickly, had an incredibly difficult time going to Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I wonder what the motivation was for them to keep going back day after day, long after the soldiers had left Little Rock. I wonder what was their motivation to keep on going in such a difficult environment.
Well, there's a part of me that thinks there was an exploitation of the developmental phase of adolescence when we believe in idealism before we face the reality of what the world's really like. And they do believe they're vulnerable. They do believe they can make a difference. They're willing to fight. They also don't believe that they can get killed.
Well, I don't know. I'd have to disagree with you because they knew what the dangers were, but you take a hammer and you hit a rock. You hit that rock, you know eventually that rock is going to crack. You know it. That's the way they were brought up. That's what they were taught. You were taught, okay, look, this is your opportunity. They might spit on you every day. They might call you all kinds of names. But the bottom line is when the teacher asks a question and you're able to stand up and give that answer, that puts you on equal footing with them. And there's nothing they can do about that. I think that's more of the reason that you went to school. It wasn't a bravado or being bulletproof. It was to show, I'm human. I'm human. I can do this. For a while it says, well, black people can't read. In fact, in some places in the South, it was against the law to teach black people to read. All right. So you let them start to read, and then, okay, they're not smart enough to vote. They're not smart. They can okay read. We're not going to mix these mongrels with normal people.
And there is an answer. There is another film that actually focuses on the 9 of them. And it was pretty clear that Ernest Green and Jefferson, whose last name I forgot, had a good deal of self-interest as well. They firmly believed they would do far better, particularly Jefferson, who had only 1 year to go through this, graduating from Central High School, than they would have from whatever the segregated alternative was. And I think a couple of the girls were just damn stubborn people.
But that's what I'm saying. I mean,
Yeah.
you had to have that attitude because what you are now doing is you are carrying a race on your shoulders. And the moment you quit, told you they couldn't do it, told you they weren't that smart. Why did we even try this in the first place? You know, so it was like, we have to show that we can do this. There's so much riding on this now.
Excuse me, but do you remember the name of that other film you're referring to?
No, but it is on, it's what the focus is what they went through and their subsequent careers.
I hear that the Norman Rockwell famous painting of the little girl going through the mob is now at the White House. And I thought I heard that one of the Little Rock 9 had been trying for years to get it into the White House. Do you know anything about that at all?
No, but I can tell you something interesting about that one little girl who got mobbed.
Right.
Ruby Bridges.
The lady behind her.
Oh, yeah.
What a face.
Yeah. They actually got together. And they actually reconciled their difference. And basically what the lady behind her said was, I'm yelling because everybody else is yelling. I didn't mean it, but I mean, everybody else is doing it. I have to do it too.
And that's the danger of any mob, because the emotion carries you without any thought.
You said you went to high school at the time?
Yes.
I wanted to hear your thoughts on how, like, what would you feel like if they were going to your school?
Well, I'll have to say, first of all, my feelings might be atypical of what was going on at the time, because I come from a rather liberal family. My father also was a publisher of 2 newspapers at the time. And watching the television, we had that discussion, and neither of us, my father or I, could understand why don't they let those kids alone and just go to school. I had, I would say, a privileged education. I went to a private high school, and even then, the private high school I went to would have allowed people of any race to come in. So that's atypical of what the public schools would have had. So my feelings, I remember the tension during that period before the Eisenhower brought the troops down. I mean, we were hundreds of miles away, but it was palpable. I mean, we were wondering if the whole nation was going to fall apart.
And remember, it was a couple of years after that where you had a governor of a state standing in front of a university going, "You are not coming in here."
That's right.
I remember at 5, 6 years old, when I would get on the bus, we would automatically, they did the petitions and all of that was gone by then, and it was no more separate but equal, but still we would automatically just move to the back of the bus. It was just something you did. You rode downtown, you got off the bus, when you transferred onto your next bus, you got on, you let the white people get on first, they took their seats, and then you got on and you took what was left, and you'd ride the bus. And this is the way it was. It was, it's the unsaid and unseen, know your place, you might be equal. The law says you're equal, but come on.
And to pick up on that, to show you how unequal it was, because I remember the public buses when I was a kid, there was a board, the seats were made sort of with chrome bars, and they had holes drilled in it. And there was this wooden bar that says, you know, coloreds, and they were behind that. So when the whites came in, the sign kept moving back.
Moving back.
So while you might have 45 white people in there, 15 blacks had to cram into this space.
And you paid your fare, and you walked around to the side door. You didn't walk through the bus. You walked around through the side door to the petition, and then you took your spot.
Did you see what it was like when you went back recently?
It's the South is different. The South has become, the only thing I can say is tolerant. Black and white still don't have an affection for each other, but I think they've came to the realization no one's going anywhere. So let's just tolerate each other.
But if you were to ride a bus in Birmingham today,
No, that would be, there's none of that. Like I said, it's one of those, how you doing? Just fine. But on this breath, but that's both sides. It's just a matter of, you can still cut the tension with a knife, but it's a smiling thing now. We're happy, we're getting along.
Fast forward to 2012 and think about all of the areas that we have to deal with still with discrimination. I'm wondering if you could speak to what those areas are and who are the new icons?
Well,
Who are the new daisies and roses?
We don't need icons. I hate to say it, we don't need that anymore because the new I guess that if we are going to need icons, we need the people who are going to talk about the real battle that's coming up. The battle, this one crosses racial divides. The divide between rich and poor. It crosses all lines. I don't care how you look at it. And that's the new battle. And if this is a people thing. It can't be somebody pointing out, just like, who is it? Romney now is looking at Obama and going, this is the politics of envy. Back to what I said before, someone to point at and say, this is the problem. Not the real problem, not the inherent racism. It's the person who's talking about the racism that's the problem. And that's where we are now. So we can't have one person. It has to be a group of people. It has to be everybody to say, this is unfair. We can't do this anymore. So I'm not looking for a person per se, but I would like to see us as a country, as a nation, to say, come on, really? Do we have to go here?
It's really interesting you should say that because I was in a conference on Friday and we were comparing Finland and the educational system in Finland, which is getting all these top ratings in the world for their education system in the United States. And one of the two main things they were talking about was social equality and financial equality. That's very relevant and apparent in those top performing countries. That's not apparent in the United States. How about other areas of discrimination, not just race?
Well, you do know the reason. Something I found out that was interesting, and the right for women to vote. The right for women to vote and the right for blacks to vote. They were fighting the same battle at the same time. And now to split that battle up, they gave blacks the right to vote. They didn't give women the right to vote. Women got the vote a lot later. But during that time frame, it was all one mesh.
I want to note to you that you said blacks were given the right, black men.
Yes,
Were given the right.
black men
That's
were
right.
given the right to vote.
That's right. And getting back to discussion of what we know and what we don't know, I've been taking some history classes out at New England College. Even though I graduated from college, I took a lot of history. I knew nothing, even though I took a lot of history. There's so much that we never know. And right in this state, most of us never heard of Winans, or maybe we do now because we have that war. But that man was so instrumental to this country, and we don't know him.
Yeah, but see, it's like I told you, it's called his story. Anything that deviates from Daniel Boone taming the West, you know, it's the things where it's like, what are you hearing a lot now of? We want to this goes back to just plain fear.
Yeah.
We want our country back. That's our country. Because the country they're thinking about is the history that was made up by Daniel Boone and George Washington tossing coins and things like this. It was an Anglo-centric country. And the fear is we no longer have control of that. What do we do now?
I just had kind of a question. Like, I used to go to the New Hampshire Historical Society a couple years back, and I'd go to lectures around Martin Luther King Jr. Day to find what I call alternative history, because New Hampshire is very white, kind of conservative, and sometimes you forget things, and you want to find things that kind of shake things up. Like, for example, at one time they read in this diary where this escaped slave said, I may go into Vermont, but I dare not go into New Hampshire. And I was gasping. So where are the resources for me to get out of my little complacent going back to, you know, childhood history or being able to see things differently. Like I know New Hampshire Historical Society that doesn't have the lectures anymore, but where are the good resources to, you know, remind oneself that history is complicated?
Down south. History is open to interpretation. It depends on, you know, what you're looking for and what you'll get out of it. I mean, if you're looking for just raw the experience, I'd say go to any black church in the South.
Okay.
Start in South Carolina and work your way through. Make sure it's a black Baptist church that goes for 4 hours on Sunday.
Okay.
With no books.
But if you're not going to travel,
FAMU.
if you're not going to be traveling,
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so
I think that one of the good things about all of the different influences that we're having now over the last 20 years in the way history is being written is that it's coming at us from a lot of different angles. There's the whole feminist hermeneutic of suspicion and feminist history that rewrites this, and of course we hear about this in the schools that we're rewriting, you know, the truth and everything. So my suggestion would be to contact any of the you know, a local college and seek out one of the history people there, one of the history professors, and say, okay, I want alternatives. I would like to have a feminist perspective on this. I would like to have a black perspective on this. And they will give you reading lists, and you can start reading those histories, because that's, I'm also a trained historian, and that's what we do. We look at what other people are writing to fire us to then start looking at what we might write.
Okay.
From a different perspective.
Great. Good.
But if you want New Hampshire resources, Valerie Cunningham has done quite a bit of work on the history of slavery in the seacoast. She doesn't really admit Connecticut valleys in New Hampshire. You might get Red River to show Lost Boundaries, which is the story of Doc Johnston from Keene, who was the first black naval surgeon. It's one case where the movie's a whole lot better and more accurate than the book. But there's some, you know, history there. And talk to people. I mean, there is a history of black people, African Americans, in New Hampshire for a very long time. Amos Tuck, who is a mostly mythical person, was actually in all the national school texts in the late 40s and early 50s because of his success, which is sort of documented as an independent businessman in Jaffrey. About all that's, any more that's known about him is where his grave is supposed to be.
Well, I still remember reading that New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine, I guess there was a consensus that it was not a good area to have slaves up here because snow drove them crazy. Seriously, snow drove, they had no idea what it was, and it would drive them crazy.
If you want to see an
Washington had an escaped slave in Portsmouth, and actually wrote people letters, and they ignored him.
If you want to see an interesting series of films, NPR did a series a few years ago, and it's now, you can play it on YouTube, on the story that no one wants to tell in Bagala, Maine. It's about a group of interracial people who lived on an island, and what the people of Maine did to those people, institutionalized them into school, into the state hospital, put some in jail, killed several of them, burned their houses, and as Maine became a tourist attraction, there was a boat that went past the island, and they didn't want any of the tourists to see that there were black people living there.
It's mostly Portuguese.
Well, it was mixed race.
Yeah, but it had been a Portuguese fishing community down on the river Kennebec. And outfit in Portland called SALT, which does a lot of oral histories and stuff. And they did a whole thing on, I think the pronunciation's different, of the island. But it's a very powerful story.
Yeah, very powerful story. You can find it on, if you Google it, you can get it. The story that shouldn't be told is sort of how it's put out. And, you know, there is racism. I remember when I first came to New Hampshire, a friend of mine came up and we were driving through the White Mountains and we needed some film for the camera. And we walked into this store and we thought the police was going to be called because my friend happened to be black. And it was one of those moments that I experienced prejudice and racism. And I had some of those experiences down south. I remember one of the things that really affected me and sort of influenced how I felt. I missed a bus leaving graduate school, so I literally hitchhiked and I got a ride on this big chicken truck. And he transported me 110 miles, so it wasn't a short journey. And I figured at least the thing I could do for this man is buy him a cup of coffee. So we pull into this truck stop, and we're walking to the restaurant and so forth. And just as we're about to get to the door, he says, "Oh, you can't come this way. You got to go through that door." And I looked at him and said, "What do you mean?" He says, "You're white." And then it dawned on me, because he was black, I couldn't buy the man a cup of coffee for 10 cents.